County Connection.
Nikki Folletta with BART.
Ahmed Abwali, City of Antioch.
Yvette Ortiz, City of El Cerrito.
Deborah Hawkins, City of San Pablo.
Jerry Fay with Contra Costa County.
Tom Horea, Stride Delta Transit.
Eric Hughes, City of Pleasant Hill.
Jeremy Lukirko, City of Walnut Creek.
Leah Greenblatt with TAC.
Thank you.
Dinelle LaCall, Caltrans.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to B, public comment. Members of the public are invited to address the committee. Do we have any speaker cards? I have none. Okay, moving on to item C, approval of actions. Do I have a motion?
Motion to adopt.
Okay. A second?
I'll second.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, motion passes. Moving on to the consent calendar. Let's see what items we have here. Is there any discussion on the consent calendar, or do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Seeing none, motion passes. Okay, moving on to the meat of the meeting. Item number 4, project monitoring. Stephanie?
Good afternoon, everybody. Attachment A is a STIP update. We've changed the table to show the 2016 STIP. As you know, we have a negative fund estimate due to the drop in gas tax revenue. So we've updated a table to show a few projects that were moved out and a couple of few projects moved out and a couple of projects that were deleted. So you can take a look in that table. The fund estimate was a negative $754 million for the 2016 STIP. And then for the OBAC projects, recently I sent out emails to project sponsors to collect information for MTC to create their obligation plan for FY 16-17. And in the table on page 4-6, that's the current fiscal year's plan. And a couple of projects have requested to be moved out. One of them is Danville's Vista Grande Street, and then also Martinez various streets and roads preservation. So those two projects have requested to be moved out to 17-18. And then there's a couple of new general requirements that MTC is proposing in terms of project delivery. The first one is in order to gauge project delivery or project readiness, they're using field review completion as kind of a gauge. Like if your project doesn't have or have not received their field review approval by June 30th, they're basically not including your project in the current year's plan. So that's one way they're trying to gauge whether or not the project will be ready by November 1st to submit their E76. And then the second rule is for them to stress the importance of HSIP projects. So if an agency have HSIP project with construction funding, they would like you to submit a completed E76 package to Caltrans before you can add more project to your obligation plan. So that's just to encourage or stress the priority of these safety projects for the cities and locals so that before they take on any more projects. I sent out these latest guidelines to this box, but I also left them in the back table if you want to grab a copy. And that's it. And then lastly, just another reminder that the FY 16-17 OBAC projects, November 1st is the E76 deadline. I'm done. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. That was just information. Yep. Moving on to item 5, update on upcoming One Bay Area grant, OBAG 2 and Measure J call for projects. Brad?
Yes. Hi, everybody. This is long. This can take a while. And there are two sets of funding programs that need to have calls for project. One of them is the OBAG 2, One Bay Area Grant 2, and that is a set of federal funding, STP and CMAQ, that comes through MTC. And they've adopted a Resolution 4202 that set the basics of it, and it made some revisions to the previous Resolution 4035, which applied and set up OBAG 1. MPC is considering a couple of changes, so some of the things, and I'll mention them as we go through it, will likely change, but we don't know exactly. We know some of the changes, we think, but we don't know some of the other ones. And I'll point to those out as we go along. Resolution 4202, MPC is going to give Contra Costa about 51.5. That was the original amount. Now they're going to give us about 56, or at least we think they are. We don't know whether it's going to be STP money. We don't know if it's going to be CMAQ money, so some of the discussions we'll have later about how we deal with those two fund sources, there's still some question about them. The OBAG 2 program has a purpose of trying to carry out MPC's Plan Bay Area and to achieve the goals of California's climate statutes, AB 32 and SB 375. The MTC has changed the factors that we're supposed to consider. They're even perhaps more focused on particular areas of the county and giving some areas perhaps a benefit that other areas won't have. The factors are on page 5-3. Projects located in high impact areas such as PDAs that take a lot of growth or have experienced a lot of growth, dense job centers that are near transit and housing, especially those with reduced parking standards and TDM strategies, projects located in communities of concern, investments that are consistent with the Air District's planning Healthy Places, which you can read online, and PDAs that overlap or are co-located with areas near freight transport and where people are exposed to toxic air contaminants. Now, the MTC was considering a reward program, and I think they will still have that reward program. It's probably not going to affect. None of you are going to be rewarded in all cases, in almost all likelihood. The money will almost certainly go primarily, if not exclusively, to San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, because it will reward jurisdictions with, we're not sure if it's CMAQ, probably CMAQ money, that reward jurisdictions that produce affordable housing, very low and moderate income housing. And it will be for those up to 10 jurisdictions that produce the first 80,000 of those units over this current RENA period. So it's likely, since they're big cities and they have, in many cases, more money to do that kind of development, that those will be the jurisdictions. It's possible that one of maybe Richmond or some other jurisdiction that's produced a lot of housing of that sort will get some money, but I wouldn't hold your breath. Not that producing the housing isn't a good idea. The OBAG 2 funds can be used for a number of different types of projects: CMA planning, local streets and roads preservation, bike ped improvements, TLC projects, safe routes to school projects, priority conservation areas, PDA planning grants, and federal aid secondary grants. We didn't have any federal aid secondary money the last time around, but we do this time. And it's a required amount of money, it's a requirement set by the state. It used to be set by the feds. The feds got rid of it. The state kept it, so we have to spend a certain amount of money. On page 5-4, it shows the amount of money under the original proposal, and this will change somewhat based on what MPC does. Originally, we were going to get $1,461,000, of which a little over $4 million had to go to Safe Routes to School projects. 1.3 of it had to go to federal aid secondary, which is primarily going to go to the county, if not exclusively, because it's for rural roads. And 4.3 million is going to go to the CMA for planning and outreach. Now, the remainder is subject to one of OBAG's requirements, which is 70% of the funds have to be spent in or near PDAs. And that's under the original amount, 41.7 million. Since we're getting 56, and they're not changing the Safe Routes to School, FAS, and planning and outreach amounts, we think, and we won't know until next week, that we'll probably have another 5 million or so it'd be 46 million that's subject to the 70% requirement. Originally, we were going to get that 51.5 million in two chunks, 31 million in STP money, which is the most flexible sort of money, and 20.3 million in CMAQ, which has to have a air quality benefit. So it can be used for a much smaller set of project types. Though it can be used for Safe Routes to School. It cannot be used for federal aid secondary. It can't be used for planning. Any planning has to use STP funds. MTC requires that the average grant in Contra Costa must be $500,000. Last time we had the same requirement. We did fine. It was $700,000, if I remember correctly. The grants can go as small as $100,000, as long as the average is 5. The Measure J TLC program it's intended to support local efforts to achieve compact mixed-use development and development that's PED-friendly or linked into the overall transit system. The funds are allocated to the regions by population, and they are supposed to go through and make sure that the funding is allocated to the projects that best achieve those objectives. The Measure J explicitly notes that it's not to be allocated by formula to the jurisdictions. We're estimating that there'll be about 27.7 million available for program through that program through fiscal year 2022, which is also the period for the OBAG 2 program. The Measure J PBTF program is allocated competitively countywide, with the Countywide Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee making those, reviewing the projects and making the recommendations. We did a project survey. Most jurisdictions submitted projects. There were about 68 submittals. There were exactly 68 submittals. And they were asking for $120 million total. That significantly exceeds the amount available through the three programs. So there will be a fair amount of competition, and the projects, the number of projects submitted for the 3 programs and the amounts requested are included on page 5-6. They are, when you count them up, you'll notice there are more than 68 projects. That's because some of the project sponsors intend to apply for or are considering applying for more than one program. So the approach, we've been working with a working group of local staff from different agencies, jurisdictions, and transit agencies on coming up with an approach to OBAG 2 and to the other programs, and trying to come up with a coordinated program. We've gone through 2 meetings, and some of the people on that working group are in this room today. They'll identify themselves if they wish. In OBAG 1, this is the approach, some of the suggestions that they've made. In OBAG 1, we took all the STP money that wasn't allocated to CMA planning and put it by formula to local streets and roads. CMAQ money cannot be used for maintenance. So all the STP money was allocated by formula. It was done using the MTC formula. We have gone through and worked with MTC staff to update their formula and the inputs to it, and have come up with a new allocation using that formula and assuming that all the STP money, and that would be, as you see on page 5.4, $25.5 million that would be allocated. Now, in attachment A, there's an estimated allocation to the 20 jurisdictions based on that formula. So there's the 24.5, and it ranges from about $4 million to the county of Contra Costa to about, I think Clayton's the small one, at 275. All of them are above the 100,000 minimum, so that's not an issue. There may be additional STP money. There may not be. We don't know yet. We're hoping that MTC staff will let us know in the next couple of weeks. There's an issue that was raised about the competitive portion, which is the remaining CMAQ funding, and how that should be used. And there were some issues about geographic equity. As you know from the factors that MTC includes, there's a definite interest on their part, and certainly their executive director has made that plain, that they don't like to see geographic equity. They don't like the peanut butter spread. That's the metaphor that Steve Heminger has used. They like chunky peanut butter. But one of the recommendations is that at least one of the, each subregion would get at least one of their project. It would have to be the highest ranking project. And there could be a problem because last time around, there was about 16 million left in CMAQ, in STP funds, and about 25 million in let me say that again. There were about 16 million in STP that was used for local streets and roads, and about 25 in CMAQ that was used for the competitive portion. Those ratios are switched this time around. The ratios will probably change depending on whether we get more STP or whether we get more CMAQ money. But we have a much smaller pot in the competitive pot, so given that the working group is recommending a maximum of 5, and 4 times 5 is 20, and we only have 16 million, then if every project is larger, then we may have to use some of that STP money to make each of the region's top projects whole. So that is a recommendation of the working group, so that 25 million could be, that we show in attachment B, could be reduced. In addition, if one of the top scoring projects is a planning study, that planning studies, as I mentioned earlier, will need to use STP money as well. There may be ability to do some swapping if one of the maintenance projects has some bicycle pedestrian components that aren't already, that would be new components, and those can be funded with CMAQ money. But that is complicated, and if the project sponsor would have to go through that process of having a somewhat complicated project and funding program. I wouldn't suggest it, but we discussed the project area, and the working group agreed that the affected project area should be defined as 1/2 mile from the project area. They wanted the call for projects package to include a lot of resource materials because some of the criteria would be would rely on an analysis of the project area and, for example, whether the density of jobs and housing within the project area. The scoring criteria that are recommended are included in Attachment C. Safe Routes to School. As I mentioned, there's a $4 million Safe Routes to School set aside in OBAG 2. The authority staff met with the Safe Routes to School Task Force on July 11th, and they've recommended taking the same approach as was taken the last time, which is to allocate the funding to the 4 RTPCs based on the earlier 50% enrollment, 50% population formula. And that is that's shown on page 5.8, the enrollment, the population, the average, and then the allocation. And so every region is going to get 880 to 1.2 million for Safe Routes to School. The TLC funding, as I mentioned earlier, can't be allocated to local jurisdictions on an as-of-right formula basis, and that the RTPC should choose projects that best meet the goals and objectives of the program. Staff suggesting that the program would allow submittals to each RTPC to ask for the full amount of funding available to the subregion, and RTPCs would be required to affirm that the recommended projects best meet those goals and were not allocated by formula. The proposed criteria used for selecting the projects are included in Attachment A, and they're very similar, almost identical to what was used in the first round. For the PBTF program, 2/3 of the funds are available through a countywide competitive program. The remaining third goes to the East Bay Regional Park District. It's supposed to be spread equally among the 4 subregions. Central County has had, all 4 subregions have had a set of maintenance and improvement projects. Central County would be the next one, followed by East, West, and Southwest in that order. As in Cycle 1, as I mentioned, the applications would be reviewed and rated by the Countywide Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. So with that, I think I've gone through everything, and I'd be interested in taking your questions and getting your thoughts about the program.
Brad, do you have any more information about the scheduling for this and when we can expect?
What we're thinking is that we'll get the, MTC should adopt the final program with the additional funding next week, and then the commission will adopt it. That we would bring this back with the full package to the TCC in August. There's some other things that would come in August. That the authority, if they have no issues, would approve the call for projects in September. The OBAG MTC staff has not given us a final date by which we have to submit our projects, but they have said that it would be a year after the commission adopts the final guidelines for the program. So that would mean that we would have to submit our submittals by July, how many days in July? 31st of 2017. So we have a fair amount of time, but it's not an infinite amount of time to get everything done. So we're thinking that we'd release it in September or October with applications due in January. And that would give jurisdictions more time to put together their applications, try to decide which way they want to go.
question.
Sorry, Betta.
Brad, my question is regarding the 70% PDA requirement. How is that affected by the formula allocation of LSRP funds?
The LSRP funds are counted when we count up the 70%. Now, when we did the survey, that was one of the main reasons why we did the survey, is to see if those local streets projects would meet, if we could still achieve the 70% with allocating the funding and a bigger share of the funding by formula through the LSRP part of it. It looks like we might be able to do that. We were, of the 68 projects, and there were a number of local streets and roads projects submitted. Not every jurisdiction submitted one. So there were something like, I think, 16 LSRP projects that were submitted. And those did, even just within that group, that subset of the 68 projects, they did achieve the 70% threshold. So there were a fair number. And last time around, we, even allocating the funding by formula, we were at about 85% that would either in or near PDA. So I think that will work. If it doesn't, then we'll have to ask the jurisdictions to give us a project that is, or use the money for another project that's not a local streets and road project. We're not sure exactly. We can give everyone a haircut just so we can achieve that.
So then every jurisdiction would be expected to submit some type of application for this amount of the funding that's allocated by formula.
Right.
And
the idea is that the application would be for all three programs, that all of them would have the basics in it. Who's the contact, who's the sponsor, what would the project do, what are you applying for, how much does it cost, how much you're asking for, where is the project, all of those basics about the project. If you were applying for the competitive OBAG portion, you'd have some other additional questions you'd have to answer. If you were applying for the TLC portion, you'd have some additional questions you have to answer. The local streets portion, since it would be allocated by formula, there would be no additional questions other than, are you in a PDA or not?
could a jurisdiction choose not to use it for an LSRP project and instead use that allocation for one of the other types of projects?
We haven't addressed that question.
Okay.
What do you think we should do?
Well, I think a project that comes to mind for El Cerrito, it's a combination project. It's both a streetscape that requires sidewalks, street trees, bulb outs, and also pavement rehabilitation. So just wondering how that project would be treated in an application such as this.
Well, some jurisdictions last time did include new ped bike improvements as part of their LSRP project. For example, Hercules added some bike lanes to a project as part of the repaving of the street. And certainly that is an eligible use of the funds, and it's eligible use of STP, and it's also described as an eligible component of the local streets preservation project as described by MDC. So those components are definitely eligible. So if you wanted to include them as part of your project, that would be fine, at least under MDC's requirements.
So sidewalk would as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Curb ramps, bulb outs, all of that.
Brad, did you say that for the PDAs, the distance of the improvements, was that 1.5 miles?
That's, well, if you look at the set of criteria, some of them describe what's in the project area, because as I mentioned, all the factors that MTC set, all of the factors relate to the project area, not to the project. It's not what the project does, it's where the project is. So the half mile was about defining where the project is. The PDA definition, you're either in it or you're not, or you're within proximate access. That's the formal term that MTC uses. And we're assuming that we will use the definition of proximate access that we used before. So you don't actually have to touch a PDA, but you have to provide access to it, and pretty direct access to it.
I have another question about the competitive portion and geographic equity and I guess the part where you might be requiring that each subregion get their highest scoring project funded. So if another subregion has really two very high scoring projects, and it gets into that, and you can't fund those two highest scoring projects because you have to fund another project for another region. Do you imagine that could happen in terms of the math and the maximum project
Sure.
grant amount?
Yeah, definitely, it could.
And I guess I guess I have concerns about that when when one of the MTC's requirement is that you don't do this formula basis for grant award. And we're already doing the LSRP by formula. And so are we doing a lot of things by formula, and we're leaving very little money available for that competitive element of the program?
Well, that was definitely discussed at the working group. There was one area in OBAG 1 that did not get any funding through the competitive portion last time. And that was a sore point. Yes, it was. And to avoid that soreness, I guess, MTC doesn't strictly forbid making some effort towards geographic equity. But the factors don't support that. But they don't say you can't do it either. So, because it's not strictly forbidden, and to make the process go more smoothly, that's why the working group's suggesting that approach.
Another question regarding the working group. Chad Smalley was the West County rep on that committee or subcommittee, and I don't think he attended any of the meetings because he left Richmond before then. So I'm just a little bit concerned that there's no West County representation in that subcommittee. Or you're attending now? Okay, great.
Yeah. I stepped up.
Oh, you're stepped up. Great. Thank you.
Yes, we've got someone from each of the four parts of the county. Oops. I don't know if there's any suggestions on one other component that we really haven't talked about, which is the criteria for the OBAG 2 program. The screening criteria I should probably go through these. The screening criteria are basically the same. There were some changes that we've made on the minimum request size. We changed to $400,000 for the competitive program and $100,000 for the other sub-programs, and set the maximum at 5. So 5, which as I mentioned before, 4 times 5 is 20. The criteria, as we did in the last round, we've divided them into 3 parts. One part is the context criteria, and those follow pretty directly out of what MTC put in Resolution 4202. Is it in a PDA? Is it in a community of concern? What was its past housing growth? And we used the housing growth for the whole jurisdiction and measured it on whether it met its RENA target. And this is the total RENA target. The forecast housing growth, it's whether the PDA is expected to take on a significant amount of growth. A measurement of whether there's a job center is dense and near transit, and whether it's near housing, and those are two separate criteria. And there's the question of quality transit service, and we need to define what that is. And then the TDM measures and traffic management strategies, those are both components of the Planning Healthy Communities document that the Air Districts has established. The project criteria are safety, connectivity, whether it increases the use of alternative modes, whether it's clearly defined project, whether there's we say sustainability, but it's in the limited sense of whether the project sponsor is able to keep the project up. Whether it removes a certain amount of constraints to bicycle, constraints to the development of the PDA, whether it's ready. We made some tweaks from the last time around on that criterion, excuse me. Community support, we made some changes to that as well. Does it have policy support from the jurisdiction? Is it in a plan, or the jurisdiction adopted a resolution of support? And whether there was community outreach to identify or review the project, or whether it was both. And then the sponsor delivery record and matching funds, there'd be some extra points for having more than the required 11 at 5.47%. And the third component is the cost effectiveness, where it's the number, it's basically how many dollars does it take for each point that you earn through all the other criteria. It's sort of a complicated formula, but that's the basic idea. How many dollars does it take to earn 1 point of score? And that all adds up to 100.
Brad, you mentioned growth, housing growth, not housing actual density. So areas that are already built up, don't have much more room for growth, they're going to be penalized?
Not penalized. I would not describe it as penalized, but not earning points. You don't get negative points. We might assume that if you've, what is it? A carrot is a stick painted gold, or orange, I guess. But that is one of the factors that MPC has, is whether the PDA has experienced significant growth, or whether it's expected to experience significant growth. So we broke that into two separate criteria. And as you've noticed, we've set weighting for each of them. The context criteria would be about 1/3 of the score, and 4 points, potential points for each of those criteria. The project criteria, they're mostly 5 points and make up a little over half. The project readiness and the sponsor delivery record get 8 points. There have been some issues with sponsors delivering projects, and given that this federal money, it has much stricter deadlines, and there is the danger of losing the money to the county if the project is not delivered, which has happened. We've given those two criteria extra weight. And the cost effectiveness is also 8 points.
Quick question, Brad. First of all, you were just talking about the sponsored delivery record. How do you define a failure? Actual money removed in the past by...
That's the idea. If you had a project, money was allocated to you, programmed to you, and you didn't deliver the project.
Okay. Second question, these scores are on here for the different categories. Are they pretty much final at this point, or are they...
That's why we're bringing it to you. There's our idea was that we would bring the basic outline of what we worked out with the working group, and then we would bring back the whole package, including the application and the instructions and links to the resource materials to you in August for a final approval before it goes to the planning committee and to the authority.
Jerry, I have a question. Is that okay? No, that's fine. So I had a question regarding the matching funds. Can we, if we apply for both Measure J funds at the same time we're applying for OBAC funds and relying for Measure J funds as potentially matching funds, is that allowed or not?
You've done it before, Yvette.
I know, but the Measure J call came out first, and so it was secured before I went for the federal money.
Right. It is something that we're open to. That's one of the reasons why. It's one of the reasons why we want to do a coordinated call so that we could use some of the money for matching some from the Measure J programs.
So
It's harder to do with the PBTF, but the subregions would have to make some kind of
contribution.
We'd have to work on it somehow. We haven't completely worked out how that would work, but we wanted to leave some time after the projects are submitted and scored for us to try to work so that there'd be some way for us to possibly use some of the Measure J money as a match.
So the wording on page 514 for the screening criteria regarding matching funds, it says that that the applicant has secured or obligated the funding for the required local match. Can we revise that language? Because we wouldn't have secured or obligated by the time we apply.
I think we could, I'll have to think about how to reword it.
Okay.
But you're right, if there has to be some way of adding some kind of additional phrase or is able
Currently
to achieve.
applied for
or something
other
like that.
funding.
I'm going to make a note of that.
Is there any other comments or questions? Brad, I just had a quick question on I guess, kind of to build on Eric's question with regards to the point values. And I guess going back to the failure, no failure, and that's 8 points, as well as readiness 8 points, whereas everything else in that category is kind of floats around 5. Just trying to give more weight to.
We have, like I mentioned, we have had some issues with losing funds. It looks like we're probably going to lose an earmark from a jurisdiction in the county because the project's changed over time. Not unreasonably, but but MTC wants to use, and the project's hung on for quite a while. And there were been some other projects that I can think of one that had a project and got funding. This was through the CMA block grant that lost its funding because it couldn't. Jurisdiction had some inability to provide the matching funds, so they wanted to downscope the project, and then we ended up losing that funding as well. So that's something we don't like to do. I don't think anyone in the county wants to lose money. It just doesn't feel good. And that's one of the reasons why it's one of the two highest, well, one of the three highest criteria. I mean, one of the reasons we're bringing it here is if you think that it needs to be, it should be 5 and something else should be 8. That's why you're here to debate the weighting. And again, there'll be another opportunity in August after you've thought about it.
So, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, go ahead. I was going to see if there's any more questions.
Regarding the last matching funds that we've been talking about, is that depending on how much you're over the 11.47%, is that an incremental point value you get for that, or how would
that would be the idea, yeah. We didn't come up with an actual range there. That's a question that the working group will have to work out. But the idea is that say you doubled it,
Sure.
then you'd get 2 points, and if it was say 25% higher, then and you provided more, say 20% match instead of 11.5, then you'd get 2 points, and if it were 30% match, then it would be higher. But that was the idea. Or we could leave it to find out what the range of matches is, and that's something we'll discuss with the working group as well. It's part of the final.
I had one follow-up question, Brad. On the attachment D, the TLC criteria, there's weights provided for the PVTF, and obviously we've just been talking about the scoring criteria for the OBAG 2. There really doesn't seem to be any scoring criteria for the TLC program. There's the 4 criteria that are identified, but there's no weights assigned to it, and it's kind of unclear. Even number 4, it says matching funds, but it doesn't show if there's a minimum obligation that's required. And so I realize that the RTPCs are actually going to be the ones evaluating their top scoring projects. But is there any additional guidance or anything that these criteria can provide local jurisdictions before they go through a application process? Because some of these are very broad, and maybe it's okay to be that way, but that's completely different from like the PVTF program that actually has weighted scoring, and so I just wanted to find out your thoughts on that.
Well, there are 2 sides that I'd like to mention. On the one hand, we want the RTPCs to go through the process of ranking the projects and not to allocate the funding by some formula to each of the jurisdictions within that region. That is clearly forbidden under Measure J, although it appears that it has been done that way. But on the other hand, there are variations in among the 4 subregions, and how they might want to weight those different criteria will depend on what the RTPCs see as the particular needs and what's more important in their subregion than others. So, I mean, we could ask that the RTPCs establish those weights when they do their evaluation of the projects, but to give them the responsibility to do that, their own internal weighting.
So I see this as an action. What type of action are you looking for this committee to take if we're going to have it back here in August?
Today, I just wanted to get your initial thoughts and questions so that we can make some changes, take some of the issues back to the working group. We're going to try to work things out early in August and then bring something back that's full-blown to this committee. And then at that point, we'll ask for your recommendation to send it to the planning committee and to the authority for their approval and release.
So really no action today then?
No
Okay.
action today.
Is there any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right. Is there any further discussion from the committee? Seeing none, I will adjourn the meeting till, this says September 15th, but it sounds like we're meeting in August. August 21st?
Not the 21st, earlier, I think. I think it's,
Just reading what you give me. 18th?
I think
August
that's right.
18th? Okay. Meeting adjourned.
Okay.
A lot of people, at least on ours, CC County, their seat doesn't get in there sometimes. You know what I mean?
I went to the mayor, probably. I'm just curious because Barbara got City of San Pablo and the City of El Chico both wanting, they want you to sign on to a petition saying you need to include Barbara.
criteria in the scoring, I sense a lot of self-counting influence. You what? I sense a lot of self-counting influence from what happened in the world. Well, I see no, I even sense like one of the criteria was like removing constraints. Right, but it was defined differently. It used to be, as part of the project, has always been like removing obstacle, encouraging bike and pedestrians. That's usually how it's traditionally defined. But now on the top tier, the maximum point, for the example they listed was the development will not happen in those projects. It's not tied to safety, education, destination. I mean, I would personally define, because that's what the project has, things like an obstacle should be the highest score, right? Versus whether or not development project is moving forward with the house project. That should be.
Well, but TTC wants development. I mean, what areas not south?
Well, no, but just in general, I mean, the whole context section of the scoring, 30 points out of 100, 36 out of 100, it's all geared toward that. I mean, it's where the project located, not what the project does.
Well, that's the way but there are no COs in town.
Well, and I'm not saying things out here specific.
No, there is community concern.
Yeah, Park Center.
No, no. Olympic in California. Little tribe. Little tribe.
The heck is there? It's just a rectal office.
That's based on demographic data.
Yeah, how many percentage of households?
Yeah. You're right on downtown Florida.
Well, that's good. That's good because then now we can submit an application down there.
That one street.
Yeah. We talked about the Olympic corridor study. I know county would be wanting to move on. Yeah, I didn't know we had a designated.
Yeah, I've been trying to. I think I sent out a map somewhere. I can't remember where, but
I know Concord is all the money.
oh yeah,
That whole area is. I seem to remember that there was a small one in Walnut Creek, but it was so.
It's almost a joke when you mention it.
I don't know. Like I said, it's not secondhand. And I started my list of say not to that was
Oh, it's near there. We picked part of the reason why. There are a lot of people.
There's always a reason.
Organization of concern.
Yeah, that's why I say it's white and red.
I think it was one.
I live in Vallejo, and I live on a loop. It's just
That one street.
that's kind of narrow, not super narrow. But because of the curviness, one side is painted.
There's Alma that goes south
Well,
by you said by California and Olympic, right? You're thinking of Bonanza.
11 feet of curve between my driveway and my next neighbor's driveway. Always park there.
Oh, you know what? If it's
So there's
Olympic,
only 9 feet of non-slope
right?
parking.
California and Olympic.
So I called city, I talked to them, nothing ever happened.
You quickly would tell them there's a little weird.
I go out and talk to the superintendent, I painted the curb red. City manager, I talked to the city manager, and he asked me something, I said, well, I don't want anybody in trouble, so that's what they did, that
It must be south of it.
that's what they should do.
Or
But you know, there's that building that's not.
yes,
Come underneath the freeway, and it's that door.
it's on the right hand side.
Right-hand side.
Yeah.
There's a little street.
Okay. Not
so well-to-do.
My question is,
So, he says
who
almost.
made this happen? Because you don't even know.
We don't, it's all completely done by form for red.
Oh, so, okay.
He goes, you have a problem, and I did, number one, I just kind of lost my.
So the lower,
Poverty level.
the more low-income housing, the greater likelihood that it'll be, that area will transform. Right? Because that's going to be the low income, and that's typically lower